The world ended between one heartbeat and the next. That was how Robb Stark would later describe it to Theon. If Theon had been there, if there had been a later, if the words would have come at all. One moment the army of the North was encamped on the banks of the Tumblestone, fires guttering in the autumn rain, the smell of horses and wet wool and wood smoke, thick as a blanket over 10,000 men. The next, the sky cracked open like an egg struck against stone, and the light that poured through was not the gray-green light of a Westerosi storm. It was white, ancient. It smelled of something older than the neck, older than the wall, older than the names carved into the crypts beneath Winterfell. Grey Wind felt it first. The dire wolf was on his feet before Robb's eyes had even opened, enormous gray head swinging toward the west, lips peeled back not in aggression but in something closer to awe, the posture of a creature, recognizing another predator's territory. Then the ground lurched. The fires scattered sideways in a wind that came from everywhere and nowhere. And Robb Stark was falling through a light that tasted of lightning and old stone and endings. He landed on grass. Real grass, soft and cool with dew, spread across a plain so wide it made the Riverlands look like a courtyard. Gray Wind hit the ground beside him a half-second later, already scanning, already cataloging threats with those pale gold eyes. Behind them, with a sound like the gods clearing their throats, came the rest, 400 men of the northern host, stumbling and cursing and reaching for weapons that were mercifully still at their sides. The great John landed on his hands and knees and came up swearing in terms that would have made a salt wife blush. Rickard Karstark drew his sword before he'd even found his footing. Roose Bolton, characteristically, simply stood and looked at the horizon with those pale, patient eyes, as though strange worlds were merely an inconvenience to be managed. Robb stood. He was 16 years old and a king, and he had learned that the first thing a king must never do is let his men see him frightened. He was frightened now, the cold kind, the deep kind, the kind that lives in the chest and pulls at the lungs. So he squared his shoulders and looked west. The mountains were wrong. Not wrong the way a rumor is wrong, subtly off in a way that takes time to identify. Wrong the way a dream is wrong, where familiar shapes were unfamiliar faces. They were too high, too jagged, too ancient, and carved between their flanks was a valley he had never seen on any map in Maester Lewin's collection. At the valley's mouth, against the darkening sky, he could see walls, a fortress, and beyond the fortress, moving across the plain in a column so vast it swallowed the horizon like a tide, came a light, 10,000 torches, perhaps more. Your Grace. Great John was at his shoulder, and his voice, for perhaps the first time in his considerable life, was quiet. Where in the seven hells are we? I don't know, Robb said. He watched the torchlight spread across the plain below. He watched the distant fortress walls, tiny with distance but unmistakably real, unmistakably occupied. He watched Grey Wind, who had stopped snarling and was now staring toward the fortress with an attention that meant people, frightened people, people who matter. The dire wolf had never been wrong about that. We are not in Westeros, Roose Bolton said from several feet away. He said it the way other men might note that it was raining. No, Robb agreed. And those, Great John squinted at the distant torchlight, are a great many fires for a peaceful evening. They are, Robb said. He watched the column move. Even at this distance, even in failing light, there was something wrong with the way they moved. Too uniform, too relentless. Men on a march had a rhythm to them, the natural sway and shuffle of human fatigue. These things did not sway. They did not shuffle. They marched with the mechanical certainty of something that had been built for exactly this one purpose and intended to fulfill it before dawn. He turned to find his bannermen watching him. 400 faces, frightened and cold and waiting for their king to tell them what to do. He had learned, in the months since his father's head had fallen in King's Landing, that this was the heaviest thing a crown could contain, not power, not privilege, but the specific weight of 400 sets of eyes that would follow you into the dark if you simply started walking. Robb started walking toward the fortress. Your Grace, Karstark began. There are people in that keep, Robb said, without slowing. And something is coming for them. We are soldiers of the North. What else would we do? Grey Wind fell into step at his left knee. The Grachan's great laugh boomed out behind him, startled and genuine and already reaching for its sword. He heard the 400 begin to move, the specific sound of northern men deciding. That fear was something to be addressed later. Once the work was done, he did not know what world this was. He did not know the name of that fortress or the nature of the enemy bearing down upon it. He did not know how he had come here or how he would leave. He knew only that there were walls ahead that someone had built to protect, something worth protecting, and that something was coming that meant to tear them down, and that he was Robb Stark, king in the north. And the north did not turn away from walls that needed defending. Above him, in a sky full of stars arranged in constellations he had never learned, the moon rose white and cold and full, and gray wind raised his great head and filled the unfamiliar dark with a howl that rolled across the plain like thunder. If you want to see more characters cross into different worlds and universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The gates of Helm's Deep opened 3 inches and no further. That was the measure of the trust offered. 3 inches of torchlight, 2 spear points, and a voice that carried the particular tone of a man who had been expecting catastrophe all evening and was unsurprised to find it arriving from an additional direction. The voice belonged to a guard whose name Robb would later learn was Eothane, a young rider of Rohan with good instincts and an entirely reasonable suspicion of 400 armed strangers who had appeared from nowhere on the eve of the largest battle his people had ever faced. State your name and your purpose, Eothane said, in a language that should not have been comprehensible and yet was. The words arriving in Robb's mind with the same strange clarity as everything else about this world, translated by whatever force had pulled them here, or perhaps by something older. The universal grammar of men who are afraid and trying not to show it. Robb Stark, Robb said, king in the north. And my purpose is to help you hold these walls, if you'll let us. A longer silence. The 3 inches of torchlight did not widen. You are not Rohirrim, Eothane said. No. You are not men of Gondor. No. Then what are you? Robb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Northerners, he said finally. We fight well in the cold, and we don't break easily. Beyond that, I'm not sure the details matter much tonight. Gray Wind chose this moment to step forward into the thin bar of torchlight, and Eothane made a sound that was not quite a word. The dire wolf was the size of a small horse, pale-furred and golden-eyed, and regarding the gate with an expression of patient interest. Behind him, the great John loomed like a particularly bellicose cliff face, axe over one shoulder, grinning with the specific delight of a man who finds new and improbable situations genuinely entertaining, rather than merely terrifying. The gate opened. Not all the way, there was caution here, and Robb respected it, but enough to admit them single file, which they did, for 100 northerners filing into the fortress called Helm's Deep with their hands visible and their weapons sheathed, because Robb had given the order quietly as they'd crossed the last quarter mile and his men had obeyed it without complaint. That was one of the things that had surprised him about command, that men would follow a sensible instruction without needing to understand it. If they trusted the source, he was still learning to deserve that trust every day. The interior of the fortress was controlled chaos, the specific kind that Robb recognized from his own camps before battle, where everything looks like disorder and is actually the visible surface of 100 simultaneous preparations. Women and children were being moved toward the caves behind the keep. Horses were being watered and fed. Men were checking weapons with the focused private attention of soldiers who know they may not get another chance. And at the center of it all, on the steps of the Hornburg's great hall, stood a man whose authority was written in every line of his bearing. An older man, gray-bearded and weathered, wearing a crown that sat on his head with the unself-conscious ease of something worn for decades. King Theoden of Rohan looked at Robb Stark the way experienced commanders look at unexpected variables, with deep suspicion, carefully controlled. Beside Theoden stood 2 others who drew the eye immediately. The first was a ranger. Robb could see it in him before a word was spoken. In the way he stood with his back to no wall and his eyes on every entrance. The way his hand rested near his sword without touching it. the posture of a man who has spent years in wild places learning to notice everything. The second was a dwarf, broad as a doorway and armed with axes that had clearly seen recent use, who looked at the northern host with professional assessment rather than alarm. "Who are you?" Theoden said. "And how did you come here?" Robb walked forward alone, leaving his men at the gate, gray wind at his heel. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak, without raising his voice, far enough to not crowd a king on his own threshold, and inclined his head. "Robb Stark, your grace, king in the north, in a kingdom called Westeros, which I suspect you've never heard of for the same reason. I've never heard of Rohan. As for how we came here," he paused. "Something pulled us through. I can't explain it better than that. We were in our world, and then we were on your plane. And we could see your walls, and we could see what was coming for them. So we came." Theoden studied him for a long moment. The ranger was watching, Robb's eyes in the particular way that meant he was deciding something. "You could have fled," Theoden said. "Whatever brought you here, you could have run from it." "We could have," Robb agreed. "Why didn't you?" Robb thought of his father, of the lessons that had never been spoken directly, only demonstrated again and again. In the way Eddard Stark had lived, that honor was not an abstraction, not a word for speeches and charters, but a daily practice, a series of small decisions, made when no one was watching that eventually constituted a life. He thought of the 400 men at his back who had followed him into an unknown world without hesitation. "Because there are people in this keep," he said. "Women, children, men who are tired and outnumbered and still standing at their posts. Where I come from, you don't leave people like that to face the dark alone." The silence stretched. Gray wind sat, which he rarely did in the presence of strangers. Theoden looked at the direwolf, then back at Robb. Something moved behind the old king's eyes. Not trust. Not yet, but the first careful stirring of a consideration that trust might eventually be possible. "Aragorn," he said quietly. The ranger stepped forward. "Walk with our guest," Theoden said. "Show him the walls." Aragorn walked the walls the way a surgeon examines a wound, methodically, without flinching, touching the stone here and there as though reading something written in the mortar. He had introduced himself simply, name and nothing more, with the particular economy of a man who has learned that titles complicate things in the short term, and the short term was all they currently had. Robb had offered the same economy in return, and they had found an immediate, wordless understanding of the kind that sometimes exists between men who have both spent too much time making decisions that other people die for. The deeping wall stretched to their left as they walked the battlements of the Hornburg, a long spur of stone connecting the fortress to the mountain's face, and Robb studied it with the focused attention he had learned to apply to unfamiliar terrain. His father had taught him to read ground the way a maester reads text, not just what was there, but what it implied, what it enabled, what it prevented. Eddard Stark had believed that a commander who understood his ground before the fighting started had already won half the battle. Robb understood the deeping wall in approximately 40 seconds. "That wall is your vulnerability," he said. Aragorn glanced at him sidelong. "Explain." "It's long and it's low, and it connects 2 points that the enemy will identify as the most efficient breach in your defenses. If I were commanding those," he gestured toward the plain below, where the torchlight had resolved itself into something enormous and organized and deeply wrong, "I would wait my assault there. Concentrate force on that single point until it gives, then pour through the gap before you can redeploy." Aragorn was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall with new eyes. "We have men posted there." "How many?" "Not enough." "No," Robb agreed. "Not nearly enough." He leaned on the battlement and looked out at the plain. The army below had stopped moving. They were arranging themselves with a precision that made his skin crawl, not the ragged organization of a human army finding its formation, men jostling and arguing and losing their places in the dark, but something mechanical, something that slotted into position with the indifferent accuracy of a key entering a lock. "What are they?" "Uruk-hai," Aragorn said. The word carried weight. "Bred for war. They don't tire. They don't fear. They follow orders with absolute obedience, and they were made with a single purpose." "How many?" 10,000. Perhaps more. Robb absorbed this. He had faced armies before, the Lannisters at Whispering Wood, the forces of the Riverlands, in a dozen smaller engagements. And he had learned. to resist the instinct to calculate odds in a straightforward way, because odds were only one factor in battle and frequently not the most important one. Morale mattered, ground mattered, leadership mattered, the willingness of men to hold their position past the point where every instinct screamed at them to run. That mattered most of all. But 10,000 was 10,000. How many defenders? He asked. With your men, perhaps 700. Robb nodded slowly, doing the arithmetic, and setting the result aside in that compartment of the mind that a commander learns to maintain for facts that are true but not useful to dwell on. Then we need to use the ground better than they do, he said. We can't match their numbers. We can match their positioning. He walked back along the battlement, Aragorn beside him, gray wind padding silently behind them both. The direwolf had been collecting information of his own, moving between clusters of defenders, pausing at each one, smelling and reading and cataloging in that deep, animal way that Robb had learned to trust more than any scout's report. When gray wind was calm, the men he stood among were reliable. When gray wind's hackles rose, Robb paid attention to who was nearby. The hackles rose slightly as they passed a cluster of men standing apart from the others. Bolton men, posted at the eastern end of the deeping wall. Roose himself stood among them, pale and precise, watching the plain below with those colorless eyes. He met Robb's gaze briefly and inclined his head, the gesture perfectly correct, perfectly respectful, and entirely empty of anything that might be called feeling. Robb held the look for a moment, then moved on. He filed it away. He spent the next hour doing what he did best, which was not inspiring speeches or dramatic gestures, but the quieter, more essential work of understanding a battlefield. He spoke to the men of Rohan at their posts, asking questions and listening carefully to the answers, building in his mind a picture of the defensive line as it actually existed rather than as it was supposed to exist. He found two positions on the Hornburg's main wall where the parapet was crumbling and would not support the weight of a sustained defense. He found a passage through the keep's interior that would allow rapid redeployment between the main wall and the deeping wall if the positions could be properly marked. He found, in the cave's bay-high, the keep where the women and children had been sheltered, a secondary exit that opened onto a narrow path along the mountain's face, narrow enough that a small group of determined men could hold it indefinitely against a much larger force. He brought all of this to Aragorn, who listened without interrupting, and then to Theoden, who listened with the focused attention of a man setting aside his skepticism, because the information was too valuable to let pride interfere with. You've done this before, Theoden said. It was not quite a question. I've made mistakes before, Robb said. I've tried to learn from them. He paused. The deeping wall needs more men. Your best men, not your reserves. And I'd like to post some of my northerners in the gap below the wall's drainage culvert. There's a channel. They're large enough to admit a man, possibly more, and if they've scouted your walls at all, they know it. Theoden looked at Aragorn. Aragorn nodded once. Do it, Theoden said. Robb turned to find the Great John already at his shoulder, because the Great John had an uncanny ability to materialize whenever there was work to be done that involved the possibility of violence. Take 40 men, Robb told him quietly. The culvert below the deeping wall. Hold it. Whatever comes through that gap, hold it. The Great John's grin was enormous and genuine and completely inappropriate to the circumstances. Aye, your grace, he said, and went. Gray Wind watched him go, then looked up at Robb with those pale gold eyes. And Robb scratched the great gray head absently and looked out at 10,000 torches, burning in the dark, patient and terrible and waiting for whatever signal would send them forward. The night, he thought, was going to be very long. The rain came first. It arrived without warning, the way rain does in mountain country, not building, gradually from overcast to drizzle to downpour, but simply appearing, as though the sky had been holding it in reserve and decided all at once that the moment had come. It fell in cold sheets across the Hornburg's battlements, turning the stone dark and slick, running in rivers down the deeping wall, and the men of Rohan cursed it with the particular feeling of soldiers who had already accepted that tonight would be terrible and resented the addition of unnecessary discomfort. The Northerners didn't curse it. They pulled their cloaks tighter and set their feet wider apart on the wet stone, and waited with the patient equanimity of men raised in a climate that regarded rain as a mild weather condition. The great John had once told Robb that the difference between a northern soldier and any other kind was that a northerner had already been cold and wet and miserable so many times in his life that battle represented, in certain respects, an improvement, because at least in battle there was something to hit. Robb stood at the center of the deeping walls, battlements, and watched the plain below and listened to the rain and thought about his mother, not for any particular reason. He had noticed, in the months since the war began, that his mind did this before battles, reached for something soft and specific, something that had nothing to do with the work ahead, as though some part of him needed to confirm that the world still contained things worth fighting for before it would consent to the fighting. Sometimes it was his mother. Sometimes it was Bran, before Bran was lost. Sometimes it was Winterfell itself, the specific smell of the great hall in winter, wood smoke and stone, and something ancient underneath. He put his mother away and focused on the plain. They came without a horn call, without a war cry, without any of the theatrical announcement that human armies used to frighten their enemies and steady their own nerves. One moment the torches were stationary, arranged in their vast and patient formation, and the next they were moving, all of them simultaneously, a tide of firelight advancing across the wet plain with that mechanical, unbroken rhythm that Robb had identified hours ago as the thing that made these creatures different from any enemy he had faced before. Men faltered, men stumbled, men felt fear and let it show in their bodies, in the small hesitations and unevennesses of a human advance. The Uruk-hai did not falter. The Uruk-hai did not stumble. They came like water finding the lowest ground, inevitable and indifferent. "Hold," Robb said quietly, to the northern soldiers ranged along the wall beside him. "Let them come." The men of Rohan had their own commanders, their own orders, and Robb had been careful not to usurp that chain of command. He was a guest here, an ally of ours, and the fastest way to become a liability rather than an asset was to start giving orders to men who had no reason to trust him. But his own 400 were distributed along the wall at intervals, slotted into the gaps in the Rohirrim's line at positions Robb had chosen during his hour of reconnaissance. And they looked to him, and he had told them what he needed from them, which was this: hold, and hold, and hold past the point where holding seemed possible, and then hold some more. The first wave hit the base of the deeping wall like a physical force, a sound that was less like combat and more like collision, the deep percussive impact of 10,000 bodies pressing forward against stone. Ladders appeared from the dark, thrown up against the wall with practiced efficiency. Robb was already moving before the first Uruk-hai crested the parapet, stepping into the space between two Rohirrim who were bracing their spears and driving his sword through the first black-armored shape that came over the wall's edge. It was nothing like fighting a man. He had known this intellectually from Aragorn's description, but there was a difference between knowing, and the difference was the specific shock of driving a blade into something that looked at him with eyes that contained no fear, no pain, no recognition of its own mortality, and simply kept coming. He twisted the blade and put his shoulder into it, and the Uruk-hai went back over the wall, and another was already behind it. Grey Wind took that one. The direwolf had positioned himself at Robb's left side, with the tactical intelligence he always displayed in combat, not attacking randomly but choosing his moments with a precision that still amazed Robb after months of fighting together. The Uruk-hai that came over the wall into Grey Wind's reach died quickly and were replaced by others, and the wall became a continuous, roaring chaos of torchlight and rain and the sounds that battles make, which are nothing like songs or stories, and everything like the end of the world happening in a very small space. Robb fought and gave orders simultaneously, which was a skill he had been developing since Whispering Wood, and still did not feel he had mastered. He could see the whole wall in his mind, even when he could only see 6 feet of it with his eyes. The mental map he'd built during reconnaissance telling him where the pressure was greatest, where his men were thinning, where a movement of 20 soldiers from one section to another would shore up a line that was beginning to buckle. It was working, barely, painfully, at enormous cost and effort and blood, and the particular kind of concentration that left a man feeling hollowed out afterward, but working. The wall was holding. Then the world came apart. The explosion came from below, from the culvert, the drainage channel, beneath the deeping wall that Robb had identified as a vulnerability and posted the Great John to defend. But the sound was wrong. Too large, too fundamental. Not the sound of men fighting through a gap, but something that existed on a different scale entirely. A sound that Robb felt in his back teeth and his sternum and the soles of his feet. The stone beneath him lurched. Cracks appeared in the deeping wall, not chips, not fractures, but cracks, running upward through the ancient stone with a speed that made no sense. That violated every principle of how stone behaved under stress. The wall did not crumble. It did not gradually give way. It came apart all at once, in a single catastrophic moment, throwing men in every direction with casual, enormous force, and where the deeping wall had been there was now a breach wide enough to march an army through, which was precisely what the Uruk-hai intended to do. Robb hit the stone of the upper courtyard hard, rolled, came up already reaching for his sword. Through the dust and rain and the ringing in his ears he could hear the roar of 10,000 voices finding something that, if they had been men, he would have called triumph. He could see the breach, the terrible gap in the wall, and through it the first wave of Uruk-hai, already pouring like black water into the space beyond. He could see, at the eastern end of the broken wall, the position where he had posted the Bolton men. They were intact, untouched. They had pulled back from the wall before the explosion, and they were watching the breach with those pale, patient eyes, and not one of them was moving toward it. Robb filed this away in the compartment with the other things he could not address yet. He looked at the breach. He looked at the Uruk-hai flooding through it. He looked at the Hornberg behind him, and the caves, and the 700 people whose survival depended on what happened in the next 30 seconds. He made a decision. Pull back, he shouted, in the voice he had learned to use when he needed to be heard over the sound of battles ending. Eastern flank to the keep. Move now. Karstark, take the left passage. Aragorn, he found the ranger in the chaos. 20 feet away, already looking at him. The gate. We hold the gate. He did not wait to see if they obeyed. He was already running toward the breach. The breach was 30 feet wide and full of death. Robb hit the leading edge of the Uruk-hai advance at a dead run. Gray wind half a stride ahead of him. And the collision was less like a man entering a fight, and more like a stone entering water. A sudden violent displacement. A spray of force in every direction. And then the terrible work of staying upright in the current. He was not trying to hold the breach. He understood, with the cold tactical clarity that had become his most reliable faculty in battle, that holding the breach was impossible. What he was doing was buying time, which was a different thing entirely. A more honest thing, a thing that did not pretend the mathematics could be changed, but simply asked how long the mathematics could be delayed. Gray wind was extraordinary. Robb had known this for years, had grown up with the direwolf's capacity for violence the way other boys grew up with their fathers' reputations. Something understood abstractly before it was understood directly. But he had never seen Gray Wind fight creatures like these. And the wolf adapted with an intelligence that went beyond instinct, not striking at the mass of the advance, which would have been useless, but selecting the Uruk-hai at the flanks of the breach, the ones who were turning to widen the gap, the ones whose removal would slow the pour rather than simply thin it. Gray Wind was not fighting. Gray Wind was performing surgery. Robb fought beside him and tried to do the same. And the 30 seconds became a minute. And the minute became 3, and in those 3 minutes, Ricard Karstark got the eastern flank moving. Through the left passage toward the Hornberg, and the women and children in the caves had another 3 minutes of distance between themselves and the breach. And that was what 3 minutes was worth tonight. Not victory, not safety, but distance, which was the only currency available. Aragorn reached him from the right, appearing through the chaos with that quality he had of seeming to materialize where he was needed, as though the battle itself had a sense of where his sword was most required and arranged things accordingly. He fought with 2 blades, a style Robb had not seen before, and the efficiency of it was remarkable, not flashy, not demonstrative, but precise in a way that reminded Robb of watching a master carpenter work. each motion exactly sufficient for its purpose and no larger. They stood in the breach together for another minute. And then Robb made the calculation that the time had come and grabbed Aragorn's arm. "Gate," he said, and Aragorn nodded, and they ran. The Hornburg's main gate was holding, which was itself a minor miracle attributable to Gimli, who had apparently decided that the gate was his personal responsibility and was defending it with an intensity that made Robb feel obscurely reassured about the universe's capacity to produce people equal to impossible situations. The dwarf was bleeding from one ear and grinning with a ferocity that suggested he was either the bravest creature Robb had ever encountered or had a relationship with mortality that most beings would find alarming. "The wall," Gimli said, without stopping what he was doing. "Gone," Robb said. Gimli's expression did not change. "Then we hold here." "Then we hold here," Robb agreed. He took stock. The gate's defenders numbered perhaps 80, 40 Rohirrim, 30 of his own Northerners, Gimli, Aragorn, and a young man in elvish armor whose name Robb had not yet learned, but who fought with the unhurried accuracy of someone for whom time moved differently than it did for everyone else. The Uruk-hai from the breach were now flooding the lower courtyard, building pressure against the gate from the outside while a secondary assault hammered it from the main approach. The gate was thick and iron-bound and old, and it was beginning, very slightly, to give. Robb found Aragorn in a brief pause between exchanges. "How long until dawn?" Aragorn looked at the sky, an instinctive consultation that spoke of years spent outdoors. 2 hours, perhaps less. "Is there relief coming?" A beat of silence, the kind that contains a complicated answer. "There may be," Aragorn said carefully. "If certain things occur, as I believe they will." Robb heard what was underneath. This, the specific uncertainty of a man who was trusting in something he could not guarantee, who had committed to a plan that depended on variables outside his control. He recognized it because he heard it in his own voice sometimes, in the moments when he told his bannermen that help was coming or that the position was salvageable. And both things were true enough to say, but not certain enough to promise. "Then we hold for 2 hours, Robb said. He turned back to the gate, and it was then that he saw Roose Bolton. Bolton had arrived at the gate's interior with 40 of his men, materializing with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. He positioned his soldiers with professional competence, filling gaps in the defensive line, and his presence was unambiguously useful and his timing was unambiguously late. He met Robb's eyes across the width of the gate chamber with that pale, expressionless regard, and Robb held the look for exactly as long as he needed to confirm that. Bolton knew he had noticed, and then he looked away, because there was nothing to be done about it now, because the gate needed his attention, and because the lesson he was still learning, had been learning since the war began, was perhaps the central lesson of command, was that there was a time to address treachery and a time to survive it. And those times were rarely the same moment. He would survive tonight, then he would address it. The gate shuddered under a blow that rang through the stone of the keep like a bell, and Robb put his back against it alongside the men of Rohan and the Northerners and the dwarf, and the ranger and the elf whose name he still didn't know, and he pushed back, and the gate held. And outside in the rain-soaked dark 10,000 voices roared their indifferent fury at a door that refused to open. 2 hours, Robb thought. Just 2 hours. Gray wind pressed against his left leg, warm and solid and certain, and Robb set his feet against the stone floor and leaned into the dark. The gate held because men refused to let it fail. That was the truth of it, stripped of strategy and tactics, and the clean language of military analysis. The gate held because 80 people decided, in the wordless collective way that sometimes happens in desperate places, that it would hold, and they put their bodies against that decision and kept it. The Uruk-hai hammered at the iron-bound wood with a battering ram that had been carved from a single ancient tree and shod with a wolf's head iron cap. And with every impact, the gate shook and the defenders shook with it and then settled their feet and held. Robb counted the blows. He had learned this in the Riverlands. That counting gave the mind something to do besides contemplate the possibility of failure, that the human capacity for endurance was significantly increased by the simple act of turning terror into arithmetic. 43 blows. 44. 45. The iron hinges were beginning to show stress. Fractures at their mountings. Hairline cracks in the ancient stone that held them. And Robb filed this information, carefully alongside everything else he had. Filed tonight in the compartment. Of facts that were true and terrible and currently unresolvable. Gray wind had stopped pressing against his leg. The dire wolf had moved, as he sometimes did in the deep moments of battle, to the center of the gate chamber, and was standing there, with his head raised and his eyes closed, in a posture that Robb had seen before and still could not fully explain. Not alertness, not threat assessment, but something older, something that went down into the wolf's ancestry to a time before domestication, before the compact between men and wolves that the dire wolves carried in an older, stranger form. He was listening to something no human in the room could hear. Then his tail moved. Once, slowly. A signal Robb knew. Something is coming. Something large. Not enemy. Robb filed this too and kept counting. 51. 52. The fighting on the walls above had reached a different phase. No longer the explosive, disorganized violence of the breach's aftermath, but a grinding attrition. Rohirrim and Northerners defending the upper parapets against wave after wave of Uruk-hai who climbed and were thrown back and climbed again with the patient, mechanical repetition of creatures that did not recalculate the odds between attempts. Robb could hear it through the stone over his head, the specific acoustic signature of sustained defensive combat, and he parsed it the way he had learned to parse battlefield sound, where the noise was densest, where it was thinning, where silence was spreading, because silence in a defensive line was never a good sign. He found Aragorn at his shoulder. "The upper walls are thinning," he said quietly. Aragorn nodded. He had heard it too. "We need to draw some of the pressure away from the parapets." "A sortie," Robb said. "A sortie," Aragorn agreed. And there was something in his voice that was not quite relief, but adjacent to it. The feeling of a man who has been thinking the same thing and needed to hear another voice say it first, to confirm that the idea was not born of desperation rather than sense. Robb looked at the gate. He looked at the men holding it. He looked at Roose Bolton, who was doing his work with perfect correctness and watching Robb with those pale eyes. He made two calculations simultaneously, one about the gate, one about Bolton. The gate could hold for another 20 minutes without him. Bolton would do nothing overt while the outcome of the battle remained uncertain. Betrayal required a winning side to betray toward, and winning side was not yet determined. "Bolton," he said. Bolton looked at him. "The gate is yours. Hold it." Something moved in those pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, or its closest approximation. Robb was giving him the most critical position in the defense, the thing whose loss would mean the loss of everything. And the message was entirely legible. "I see you. I know what you are. And I am trusting you with this knot. Because I believe in your honor, but because if you let this gate fall, you die with everyone else. And I have calculated that your survival instinct exceeds your treachery." Bolton inclined his head. "As you command, your grace." Robb turned to Aragorn. "How many horses?" "Enough." They gathered in the Hornburg's inner courtyard, Theoden's household knights. A dozen of Robb's best horsemen, Aragorn and Robb himself, in the thin gray pre-dawn light that was not yet dawn, but had stopped being full dark. The horses were frightened, wide-eyed and stamping, smelling the battle and the blood and the particular scent of the Uruk-hai, which was wrong in a way that animal noses recognized before human minds caught up. Gray wind moved among them, and they steadied, fractionally, the way animals sometimes steadied in the presence of something that was predator, enough to make their fear of lesser things seem irrelevant. Theoden was already mounted. Robb had not expected this. He had expected to find the old king in the keep, in the inner chamber with the last of the defenders, performing the necessary but inglorious work of maintaining the center while others made the dramatic gestures. Instead, Theoden sat his horse in full armor with a sword already drawn and an expression on his aged face that Robb recognized from somewhere he couldn't immediately place, and then could. It was the expression his father had worn in the Godswood the morning he left for King's Landing, the last time Robb had seen him truly at peace. The expression of a man who has located, after long searching, the place where he intends to make his stand. "Your Grace," Robb said, drawing alongside him. "You talked me into this charge," Theoden said. with something that was almost amusement. The least you can do is ride at my side. Robb looked at the gate. He looked at the gray sky above, which was brightening by degrees so slow they were almost imperceptible. The black becoming gray, becoming something that might, eventually, become gold. On your signal, he said. Theoden raised his sword. The gate opened. They went out into the dark together. And gray wind went ahead of them like a gray wind, and the sound they made. Hooves and voices, and one great wolf's howl rising above it all, rang from the mountain walls of Helm's Deep and fell across the plain like something that had always been there, waiting for exactly this moment to be heard. The charge lasted 40 seconds and changed everything. Not because 40 seconds was long enough to break 10,000. Uruk-hai. It was not, it could not be. No cavalry charge in the history of warfare had ever broken 10,000 of anything that wasn't already broken, but because 40 seconds of horses and men, and one enormous dire wolf erupting from a gate that should by all reasonable expectation have fallen hours ago did something to the battle's architecture that pure force could not have accomplished. It introduced doubt, not in the Uruk-hai themselves, who were not built for doubt any more than a hammer is built for hesitation, but in the battle's momentum, in the invisible structure of inevitability that a besieging army constructs around a fortress as the night wears on and the fortress's options narrow one by one. The momentum broke. For 40 seconds it simply stopped, and in warfare, momentum stopped is momentum that must be rebuilt, and rebuilding takes time. And time was the one thing that Helm's Deep still had to give. Robb rode hard into the left flank of the Uruk-hai mass, gray wind ranging ahead and to the right, cutting the angle that Robb had calculated during the 3 seconds before the gate opened, when his mind had done what it always did in the breath before action, assembled everything it knew about the ground and the enemy disposition and the physics of horses moving at speed through packed infantry, and produced a line of attack. Not the most dramatic line, not the line that would look best in a song, the line that would do the most damage, to the most critical concentration, in the least time, which was the line along the base of the deeping wall's rubble, where the Uruk-hai were thickest, and where their destruction would most disrupt the flow of reinforcement. Into the lower courtyard, Theoden rode beside him, and the old king fought with a vigor that made Robb revised several assumptions he had formed about aged commanders. Theoden was not fighting cautiously, not preserving himself, not performing the calculus of survival that most men perform unconsciously in battle. He was fighting with the complete expenditure of a man who has decided that this moment is worth everything he has. And the result was extraordinary. Not the technical precision of a young warrior at his physical peak, but something richer, something that drew the men around him forward, into spaces they would not have entered alone. Robb had seen this before, in his father, the way certain men, in certain moments, became something larger than themselves, not through any mystical mechanism, but simply through the visible fact of their commitment, their willingness to spend themselves completely, which gave other men permission to do the same. He had been trying to become that. He was not sure he had managed it. He was not sure, on the worst nights, that he was his father's son in the ways that mattered most. The 40 seconds ended when the Uruk-hai mass reorganized around the cavalry charge, which it did with that horrible mechanical efficiency, closing like water around a stone, and Robb gave the signal. 2 short whistles, a system he had established with his horsemen before they rode out, and they pulled back toward the gate, which Bolton had held, which was still open, which received them with the specific relief of stone. Embracing its defenders returned. And then the light came. It came from the eastern ridge, from the top of the valley's entrance. And it was not the gradual creep of dawn that Robb had been calculating against all night, but something sudden and complete. A light that arrived like a statement rather than a suggestion. Gandalf. Robb had been told about Gandalf in the brief, compressed way that men share essential information in the middle of battles, the White Wizard. If he comes at dawn, at the eastern ridge, and he had filed it alongside everything else, in the compartment of hoped for variables, things that might happen and would matter enormously if they did. What he had not been told, because perhaps there were no adequate words for it, was what it felt like to see it. The light moved down the ridge in a wave, and ahead of it, in a thunder of hoofs. That Robb felt through the soles of his boots before he heard it with his ears. Came the Rohirrim. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, the full muster of the Rittermark. The riders that Theoden had not believed were coming, that Aragorn had believed in with the specific faith of a man who has learned to trust certain things beyond the evidence available to him. They came down the ridge like a river finding its gradient, inevitable and enormous. And the Uruk-hai mass that had seemed, an hour ago, like a force beyond the capacity of the world to answer, suddenly had an answer. Robb stood in the gate of Helm's Deep and watched it happen. He was aware, in a distant way, that he was shaking the specific full-body trembling that follows sustained extreme effort, the body's delayed invoice for everything it has spent. He was aware that gray wind was pressed against his left side with a heaviness. That meant the dire wolf was tired, truly tired, in a way Robb had rarely seen. He was aware that the sky above the valley was turning gold. Real gold, the specific gold of a sun that has decided to rise regardless of what has happened in the valley beneath it. He was aware of Aragorn standing beside him. "It's over," Robb said. He meant the battle. "This part," Aragorn said. He meant something larger. Robb looked at the ranger, at the man who was not simply a ranger, he understood now, who carried something in him that went deeper than any title Robb had encountered. A quality of purpose that reminded him of the old stories. The ones the Maesters told about heroes from the Age of Heroes. Men whose lives were organized around a destiny rather than simply a series of events. He had met very few people in his life whom he would describe as necessary. People whose presence in the world felt like an answer to a question the world had been asking. Aragorn was one. He had known it since the battlements. "What happens now?" Robb asked. Not tactically, not strategically. The larger question, the one that had been waiting, since he'd landed on an unfamiliar plane and started walking toward unfamiliar walls. Aragorn was quiet for a moment. Below them, the Rohirrim were completing the route, driving the Uruk-hai into the forest that had appeared at the valley's edge sometime in the night. A forest that Robb was quite certain had not been there before, which he had added to the very long list of things about this world that operated outside his existing framework. "Now," Aragorn said, "we survive, and then we prepare." "For what?" Aragorn looked east. The gold light caught his face. "For everything that comes after," he said. The dead were counted in the gray morning light. It was the work that came after every battle. The work that songs never included because it resisted the language of songs. Not heroic, not dramatic, simply necessary. The slow and careful accounting of who had gone out and who had not come back. Robb had done it after Whispering Wood and after the camps and after a dozen smaller engagements whose names he was not sure history would bother to record, and he had never found a way to make it easier, had stopped trying to find a way, had come to believe that the difficulty was itself important, that a commander who could count his dead without feeling the weight of each name was a commander who had lost something essential. 31 Northerners. He said each name as it was given to him, quietly, in the way his father had taught him, not as performance, not for the benefit of the men watching, but because the names deserved to be spoken by someone who understood what they represented. 31 men who had followed him through a hole in the world into a battle that was not their war, for people they had never met, for walls they had never seen, because their king had started walking toward those walls and they had followed. He would carry them the way he carried all the others. It was the only thing he could do. The Grey John had survived, which Robb had not entirely taken for granted. The culvert position had been the most exposed in the entire defense, and the explosion that had destroyed the deeping wall had come from directly beneath it. He had found the Grey John after the battle with his beard singed and his left arm wrapped in a strip torn from someone's cloak and an expression of profound satisfaction on his broad face. When Robb had asked how he had survived the blast, the Great John had said, with complete sincerity, that he had been standing on top of the culvert rather than inside it because the tunnel had smelled wrong, and that this was either good instinct or good luck, and he was prepared to accept credit for either. Rickard Karstark had lost 2 sons. Robb learned this from Karstark himself, who told him in the flat, careful voice of a man who has not yet fully understood what he has been told, who is holding the information at arm's length until he can find a private place to put it down and look at it properly. Robb said what there was to say, which was not enough, which was never enough. And Karstark nodded and went back to the work of the morning, because the work of the morning was what there was. Robb filed this too, not in the compartment of unresolvable things, but in a different place. A place that had been growing since the war began. A place where he kept the costs, the specific and personal costs of the decisions he made and the battles he chose, and the positions he assigned men to hold. He had begun to understand, in the past months, that command was not merely the exercise of strategy and tactics, but the accumulation of a debt that could never be repaid, only acknowledged, only carried. He was 16 years old, and the debt was already very large. He found Theoden in the great hall of the Hornburg, sitting in a carved chair that was not quite a throne, surrounded by his surviving commanders and the organized relief of men who had expected to die before morning and had not. The old king looked exhausted in the specific way of men who have spent everything they had and found, to their own surprise, that it had been enough. There was a quality of peace in his face that had not been there the previous evening. Something settled, something that had made its accommodation with whatever came next. Aragorn was there. Gimli was there, with a cut above his eyebrow that he was ignoring with the focused indifference of a dwarf who considered wounds a minor administrative inconvenience. The elf, Legolas, Robb had finally learned, stood at the hall's entrance with that quality of alert stillness that seemed to be his natural state, watching the courtyard with eyes that Robb suspected saw considerably more than human eyes were designed to see. Theoden looked up as Robb entered. "Sit," he said, with the directness of a man who has moved beyond ceremony. Robb sat. Gray wind settled at his feet, asleep almost immediately, with the sudden totality of an animal that had given everything and intended to take what was owed in return. "You saved this keep," Theoden said. "We held it together," Robb said. "Your men held it. Aragorn held it. Gimli held it." He paused. "The Rohirrim who came at dawn held it. You identified the wall's weakness. You posted men at the culvert. You organized the eastern withdrawal. That got the civilians clear of the breach." Theoden's voice was measured, not argumentative, simply accurate. "I have been in enough battles to recognize when a stranger has come among my men and made them better than they were." Robb accepted this without deflecting it further, because Theoden was a king and deflecting. A king's honest assessment was its own form of discourtesy. "I need to tell you something," Robb said, "about one of my commanders." He told Theoden about Bolton. Not everything, not the full tapestry of his suspicion, the accumulating evidence from the months before this night, the whispers from the Riverlands that he had been weighing and setting aside and returning to in the dark hours of too many sleepless nights. He told him what he had observed directly: the withdrawal before the explosion, the late arrival at the gate, the eyes that watched and calculated and offered nothing. Theoden listened without interrupting. "What will you do?" he asked when Robb finished. Robb looked at Grey Wind, sleeping with his great gray sides, rising and falling, in the slow rhythm of deep exhaustion. He thought about his father, who had believed that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, who had tried to build a life around the principle that justice required proximity, required the willingness to look at consequences directly rather than at a distance. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. He didn't break whatever he intended. He held the gate when I gave it to him, because his survival required it. In this world, away from his resources and his allies and whatever he has arranged at home. He paused. "He is dangerous but contained. When I find a way back to Westeros, if I find a way back, the question becomes different. And if you don't find a way back?" Robb was quiet for a moment. Outside, in the courtyard, he could hear his northerners beginning the work of helping the Rohirrim repair what could be repaired. The sounds of men who had fought together through a night and emerged with the particular bond that only that specific experience creates. "Then I am a king without a kingdom," he said, "and I will need to decide what that means." Theoden nodded slowly, with the understanding of a man who has himself stood at crossroads where the familiar paths had closed. "Rest first," he said. "Everything else is tomorrow's work." Roose Bolton came to him at midday. Robb was on the Hornburg's outer wall, looking at what remained of the deeping wall, the rubble of it. the gap where stone had been, the specific melancholy of a defensive structure reduced to its component parts. When he heard the soft, precise footsteps that he had learned to identify without needing to turn around, Bolton moved the way he did everything, quietly, efficiently, with the minimum expenditure of energy required to achieve the desired result. It was a quality that Robb had once, before he understood it properly, mistaken for calm. "Your Grace," Bolton said, coming to stand beside him at the parapet. "My Lord Bolton," Robb said. He did not look away from the rubble. A silence settled between them, the particular silence of two men who are both aware that a conversation is necessary and are each waiting to see who will be honest enough to begin it. Robb had learned, from his father and from his own hard months of command, that there was advantage in making the other man speak first, not the petty advantage of a game, but the genuine tactical advantage of information, of learning what the other man thought the conversation was about before committing to a version of it. Bolton spoke first. "I withdrew my men before the explosion." "I know," Robb said. "I withdrew them because I smelled something beneath the wall," Bolton said. "A chemical smell. Something burning that had not yet found flame. I have some experience with wildfire from the campaigns in the north, and the smell was similar enough that I made a decision." Robb turned to look at him then, because the statement deserved the directness of eye contact. Bolton met his gaze with those pale, patient eyes, and his face was as unreadable as it always was, which was itself a kind of information. A man with nothing to hide generally did not work this hard at hiding nothing. "You withdrew 40 men," Robb said. "You didn't warn the men to your left and right." A fractional pause. "There wasn't time. There was time to withdraw 40 men." Another pause, slightly longer. "I made a decision under pressure that prioritized the survival of men. Under my direct command. I can defend that decision militarily." "I'm sure you can," Robb said. "You are very good at defending things in retrospect." The observation landed. Bolton absorbed it without visible reaction, which was itself a reaction. The involuntary control of a man who has been seen more clearly than he intended. Robb turned back to the rubble. He had been thinking about this conversation since the gate, since the pale eyes watching the breach with that terrible patience, and he had prepared for it the way he prepared for battles, by understanding, as completely as possible, the terrain he was operating in and the options available to him, and accepting clearly which options were not available. He could not execute Bolton here. He had no proof of intent sufficient to justify it to his own conscience or to his bannermen, and Karstark was already fragile with grief and looking for something to be angry at. And the Northerners were in a foreign world dependent on each other's cohesion in ways that made internal fracture potentially fatal. He could not imprison him. He had no facility, no guards to spare, no mechanism of northern justice that functioned 3,000 miles from the nearest godswood. What he had was Bolton, contained and watchful, in a world that had removed all the scaffolding of his power, his castle, his informants, his carefully cultivated relationships with the Lannisters, that Robb suspected but could not yet prove, his options for escape and maneuvering. In Westeros, Roose Bolton was dangerous the way poison was dangerous, not in the moment of ingestion, but in the slow, invisible hours afterward. Here, stripped of his infrastructure, he was dangerous the way a blade was dangerous, directly, visibly, a threat that could be watched and managed. "I am going to tell you something honestly," Robb said, "and I need you to understand that I am telling you not because I trust you, but because clarity serves us both better than pretense. In our current situation." Bolton waited. "I believe you withdrew your men deliberately," Robb said. "I believe you knew approximately what was beneath that wall, or suspected it strongly enough that the difference is immaterial. I believe you made a calculation about who should survive the explosion and acted on it. I cannot prove any of this. I may never be able to prove it." He paused. "But I want you to know that I see you, that I have seen you for some time, and that when we return to Westeros, if we return to Westeros, the accounting will happen. Not here, not today, but it will happen." The silence that followed was the longest yet. A wind came off the mountains, cold and clean, carrying the smell of the forest below, that impossible forest, the trees that had appeared in the night and consumed the fleeing Uruk-hai, which Aragorn had explained briefly, with the phrase "the Ents have woken." in a tone that suggested this was both significant and complicated and would take longer to explain than the current moment permitted. I hear you, Your Grace, Bolton said finally. His voice was what it always was, quiet, precise, emptied of effect. But something was different in it, something that Robb needed a moment to identify. It was the absence of the faint condescension that usually lived underneath Bolton's courtesy, the barely perceptible note of a man performing respect for a boy he did not entirely believe in. That note was gone. Bolton looked at him with those pale eyes, and for the first time in their acquaintance, Robb saw something in them that might have been genuine assessment. Not approval, not loyalty, not anything that could be trusted, but assessment, the recognition, perhaps reluctant, that the boy he had been measuring for weaknesses had developed certain qualities that complicated the measurement. You fought well last night, Bolton said. So did your men, Robb said. When it mattered, Bolton inclined his head and left. Those soft footsteps precise and unhurried on the wet stone. And Robb watched him go, and then turned back to the mountains, and breathed the cold air and tried to determine whether he had just done something wise or simply articulate. Gray wind appeared at his side, pressing a great gray head against his hip, and Robb put his hand in the coarse fur and felt the warmth of it. The specific, uncomplicated comfort of the wolf's presence, which asked nothing and offered everything and had never once in his life required him to calculate whether it was trustworthy. What do you make of him? He asked the wolf, quietly. Gray wind looked at him with those pale gold eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Below, in the courtyard, Aragorn was crossing toward the gate with the purposeful stride of a man who had learned something and was going somewhere to do something about it. He caught Robb's eye from below and held up a hand. Come down. Something to discuss. And Robb straightened and rolled his shoulders and pushed Roose Bolton into the compartment where he lived and turned toward whatever came next. There was always something that came next. He was beginning to understand that this was not a feature of extraordinary circumstances, but simply the nature of being alive in a world that did not pause to allow recovery between its demands. In Westeros, in this valley, in these mountains, in whatever world the rift had brought him to, the next thing was always already arriving while you were still finishing the last one. He went down to meet Aragorn, gray wind at his heel, boots loud on the ancient stone steps of the Hornburg, and the sun moved through a gap in the clouds and laid a stripe of gold across the courtyard below, and in it he could see his northerners and the men of Rohan working side by side in the easy companionship of people who have survived the same night. And 31 names moved through him like a tide, and he held them, and he went down into the light. Aragorn had found something in the Hornburg's lower vaults. Not treasure, though the vaults contained plenty of that. The accumulated wealth of generations of Rohirrim kings stored in the mountains keeping. Not weapons, though there were those too. Old things, beautifully made, carrying in their craftsmanship the specific pride of a people who understood that the objects they made for killing should nonetheless be made with care. What Aragorn had found was a map, and not a map of Rohan or Gondor or any territory that Robb could identify, but a map of something older, a representation of connections between places, drawn in a hand that Aragorn said he recognized as belonging to someone called Saruman, made during the years when Saruman had still been the kind of person whose maps could be trusted. The map showed rifts, not named as such. The notation was in a script that Aragorn translated slowly, with the focused effort of a man working at the edge of his linguistic competence, but described in terms that were unmistakable once translated. Places where the membrane between what is and what might be had worn thin. Places where the boundaries between stories had developed perforations, through which things could pass that were not meant to pass, in directions that the original architects of the world's structure had not intended. Helm's Deep was marked. The Valley of the Hornburg, specifically, a notation beside it that Aragorn translated as something approximating the wound that does not close, which was the kind of language that made the back of Robb's neck prickle. He knew, Robb said. Saruman knew the rift was here. He knew of it, Aragorn said carefully. Whether he created it, or simply found it and catalogued it, or attempted to use it, that I cannot say. Can it send us back? Aragorn looked at the map for a long moment, with the expression of a man giving an honest question, the honest consideration it deserved rather than the reassuring answer it invited. "I don't know," he said. "I know someone who might." The someone was Gandalf, who was in the great hall with Theoden when they brought him the map, and who looked at it with an attention so focused and so still that the room seemed to quiet around him, the way rooms sometimes quieted around people who were thinking thoughts large enough to temporarily displace the ordinary concerns of those nearby. He asked Aragorn 2 questions in a language Robb didn't recognize, received 2 answers, and then was silent for a time that stretched past comfort. "Well," he said finally, which was not the opening Robb had hoped for. "Well," Robb repeated. "The rift exists," Gandalf said. "Whether it can be made to function as a passage in the reverse direction depends on several things, not all of which are currently within my knowledge or my power." He looked at Robb with those ancient eyes, the eyes of something that had been watching the world long enough to have developed a relationship with patience that most beings could not achieve. "What I can tell you is that it will not be quick and it will not be simple. And there is a possibility, not a certainty, but a genuine possibility, that it cannot be done at all." Robb absorbed this. He had been preparing for it, in the way he prepared for all difficult possibilities, by constructing in his mind the shape of it so that, when it arrived, it found a space already made for it, rather than having to break one open. "And if it cannot be done," he said, "then you are here," Gandalf said simply. "And here has need of people like you, as last night demonstrated quite thoroughly." Robb walked out of the great hall into the afternoon light and stood in the courtyard and thought about Westeros. He thought about it the way he had learned to think, about the things he could not currently reach, not with the raw grief of absence, but with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who needed to keep those things real in his mind lest they become abstract, lest the distance make them theoretical rather than actual. His mother, somewhere in the Riverlands, doing what she always did, which was hold things together through the sheer refusal to accept that they were falling apart. His brothers, scattered by the war to places he could not fully account for, Bran and Rickon lost. Jon at the wall. Arya somewhere in the chaos of the South that he prayed daily had not consumed her. His war, the war he had started in his father's name, that he was fighting, in the names of the 31 men now laid out in the Hornburg's eastern yard, waiting for a burial that would have to be adapted to customs that were not their own. He could not reach any of it. He could not fix any of it from here. What he could do was what he had always done, which was the work immediately in front of him. He turned to find the great Jon at his shoulder, predictably, with the predictability of a man whose instinct for being present at significant moments was apparently unaffected by translocation between worlds. "We're not going home today," Robb said. "No," the great Jon agreed, without apparent distress. "Perhaps not for some time." "No. The men need to know." "Aye," the great Jon said. "They've been talking. They know something's complicated. They'll want to hear it from you." Robb nodded. He would speak to them this evening. In the courtyard, the full 431, 369 men of the North who had followed him through a hole in the world and held a wall through the longest night any of them had ever experienced, and were still here, still his, still waiting for their king to tell them what to do next. He would tell them the truth, which was that he did not know how to get home, and that he was going to find out, and that in the meantime they were in a world that needed people who knew how to hold walls, and they were going to be those people. He would tell them about the 31, each name again, in front of everyone, because the names deserve the company of the living. He would tell them that the North does not forget, not even here, not even in a valley between mountains whose names they had not known yesterday. Theoden found him as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, lengthening the shadows of the Hornburg across the courtyard in long dark bars. "Gandalf tells me you may be with us for some time," he said. "It seems likely," Robb said. Theoden was quiet for a moment, looking at the courtyard where Rohirrim and Northerners moved together in the late light, the easy intermixed industry of men who had shared something that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. "Rohan has guessed right," Theoden said. "For as long as you need it, your men will be housed and fed and treated as the allies they have proven themselves." Robb inclined his head. "You honor us." "You earned it," Theoden said. Last night cost us much. It would have cost us everything without you. He paused. There is also the matter of what comes next. Saruman is broken, but not destroyed. Sauron, he said the name with the specific weight of a word that carries more meaning than its syllables contain, remains. The war that is coming makes last night look like a skirmish. I know, Robb said. He had gathered this from Aragorn, from Gandalf, from the fragments of context that the previous hours had assembled into a picture that was incomplete, but legible enough. A darkness in the east, a war for the survival of everything, a fellowship broken but not finished, a ring that needed to be destroyed, a future that depended on a great many things going right in a situation, specifically designed to make things go wrong. He knew something about that. I am a king without a kingdom for now, Robb said. And you are a king whose kingdom has need of soldiers. He looked at Theoden. The North does not abandon allies. We held your wall last night, and we will hold whatever walls come next, until Gandalf finds a way to send us home or we find one ourselves. Theoden extended his hand. In the way of Rohan, forearm to forearm, the warrior's grip. Robb took it. Gray wind lifted his great head from where he had been, sleeping against the courtyard southern wall. Opened one pale gold eye, decided the situation was adequately resolved, and went back to sleep. The sun finished its descent. The stars appeared, arranged in their unfamiliar constellations. And Robb Stark stood in the courtyard of Helm's Deep in a world that was not his own, carrying 31 names and a kingdom's worth of unfinished business across an impossible distance, and felt, underneath all of it, the thing he had not expected to feel tonight. He felt ready. In the days that followed, Helm's Deep became something new, not merely a fortress that had survived, but a fortress that had been changed by survival. The Northerners, integrated into the Hornburgs, life with the pragmatic adaptability of men who had spent their lives adjusting to cold and scarcity and circumstances that declined to accommodate preference. They learned Rohirric words and taught Northern ones in return. They helped rebuild the Deeping Wall, working alongside men of Rohan with the focused competence of people who understood that walls mattered, that the difference between a wall and a ruin was the willingness to keep repairing it. Robb Stark wrote down 31 names in a Rohirric ledger, because they deserved to be written somewhere, and added beside each name what he remembered of the man, not deeds in battle, though there were those, but the smaller things, the specific textures of particular lives. He met with Gandalf each morning to discuss the rift, and each morning, Gandalf told him what he knew and what he didn't and what he was working on, with an honesty that Robb found more reassuring than false certainty would have been. Roose Bolton remained what he was, watchful, correct, contained, dangerous in the specific way of a thing whose nature had not changed merely because its circumstances had. Robb watched him, and Bolton knew he was watched, and neither of them spoke of it again, because the conversation in the courtyard had said what needed to be said, and the rest would wait for its proper time. And somewhere to the east, in a darkness that had been gathering longer than any kingdom of men had existed, something that did not know the name of Robb Stark or the North or the dire wolf, sleeping in the courtyard of Helm's Deep, had nonetheless taken note of a new variable in its calculations. The war that was coming would not wait for anyone to be ready. It would come when it came, as wars always did, indifferent to preparation and reputation and the distance. People had traveled to arrive at its threshold, but the North had held one wall in the dark. It would hold others. The wolf slept. The king watched the eastern sky, and the story, as it always did, prepared itself for what came next.